Jeremy Corbyn recently sat down for a wide-ranging interview with John Pienaar of Times Radio. Among the topics discussed was the question of NATO and whether it should be disbanded.
If the time was ripe to disband NATO at the fall of the Soviet bloc in the light of the Ukraine invasion, do you now, today, as you sit there, still believe it would be right to disband NATO or for Britain to leave?
I would want to see a world where we start to ultimately disband all military alliances.
I'm asking you about now,
wait a minute.
And today, here.
Yeah, I know what you're trying to do. I fully understand that. The issue has to be, what's the best way of bringing about peace in the future? Is it by more alliances? Is it by more military buildup? Or is it by stopping the war in Ukraine and the other wars which you haven't mentioned at all in this discussion that are going on at the present time, which are also killing a very large number of people? And ask yourself the question, do military alliances bring peace, or do they actually encourage each other and build up to a greater danger?
Yeah.
I don't blame NATO for the fact that Russia's invaded Ukraine. What I say is, look at the thing historically and look at the process that could happen at the end of the Ukraine war.
Yeah. And your conclusion at the end of that argument, I'm going to move on, but your conclusion at the end of the argument you have just given is that it would be right to disband NATO now.
Look, it's not going to be disbanded now. I think will happen is some kind of much deeper security discussion, as indeed NATO was having a security discussion with Russia until last year. They were even having joint exercises only 3 years ago.
This hasn't changed.
My view is that military alliances tend to build up a mirror image of each other, and you get the danger because of that.
And we'd be better off with that, Nazi.
Well, I think we'd be better off in a world at peace rather than a world at war. And we'd be better off with all those resources, instead of going into military equipment and military development and military expenditure, we're actually dealing with the world food crisis and the environmental crisis and the health crisis that we face at the present time. Money spent on weapons is money not spent on health, education and housing.
I thought that was a fairly reasonable answer. Corbyn says clearly that he doesn't blame NATO for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And in fact, earlier in the interview, he was clear that Russia bears sole responsibility for the attack. But he does make the point, which seems to be a fairly obvious and uncontroversial one, that military build-up amongst the members of one so-called defensive alliance tends to lead to military build-up in countries outside of it. Corbyn didn't comment on whether or not NATO should disband now. That's what the host was trying to get from him. And, of course, everything he said there has been Corbyn's position throughout his time as a politician. And it didn't garner much comment when he was Labour leader. However, it's now become a massive stick with which to beat Keir Starmer with. This was Sophie Rayworth on the BBC.
Can I ask you about Jeremy Corbyn? He did an interview this week. While he was Labour leader, he said NATO should reduce its presence along Russia's borders. He said that he couldn't say if he would come to the aid of a NATO ally if it was attacked by President Putin. What does it say about your judgment that you campaigned to make him leader, for him to become the next Prime Minister?
Well, the first thing I'd say is the position of Jeremy Corbyn on NATO and my position are very, very different. I went to Brussels just the other week to see the Secretary-General of NATO to talk about the situation in Ukraine and to make absolutely clear the Labour Party's unshakable support for NATO. Labour was, of course, Ernest Bevin, the Labour minister, was the politician who signed the treaty for NATO on behalf of the United Kingdom. So I've been very, very clear where the Labour Party under my leadership stands.
As has Jeremy Corbyn on his attitude to NATO.
When Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party, we maintained a pro-NATO position, not least because of those of us in the party arguing for that position. So the Labour Party position never changed on NATO. It's been a very important part of our defence and our security for many, many years. We were there at the start when NATO was set up, and we're there very strongly now.
Given his views now, do you look back and think that you were wrong to campaign for him in the way that you did?
I think I was right to argue through those years and in the 2 years or so that I've been leader about the importance of NATO.
I'm talking about him.
Well, we as a party never shifted our position on NATO.
But
and that's
wrong
because
to campaign for him, given the views that he held?
Well, the Labour Party position at the last election was pro-NATO, as it was the election before and the election before that.
So part of Starmer's answer there was at least coherent. It was the case that Labour remained committed to staying in NATO, whether or not Corbyn was keen on the policy. The other part of that answer, though, was just, frankly, pathetic. The 2019 election was just over 2 years ago. Everything we know about Corbyn now, we knew then. So either you, Keir Starmer, tried to get someone elected who you thought was dangerous and beyond the pale, or you're now just falling into line and pretending you think Corbyn is dangerous and beyond the pale because it gets you kudos from right-wingers. Neither of those options make you look good. I just want to briefly show you the next part of that exchange, because in it, Starmer goes from fairly pathetic to downright dishonest.
Will he ever be a Labour MP again?
Well, it's very difficult to see how that situation can now be resolved. He lost the whip because of his response to the Equality and Human Rights Commission in relation to anti-Semitism. I made it very clear. First thing I said as Labour Party leader, that I was going to tear out anti-Semitism by its roots in our party. I've also made it clear that our position in the Labour Party is not to accept the false equivalence between, Russian aggression and the acts of NATO.
So that's basically a no. He will not be a Labour MP again.
Well, I'm very clear on my positions on those two issues, very, very clear.
So there were two issues which Starmer there cited as a block to Corbyn regaining the whip. One was his response to the EHRC report. We've talked about that issue at length. The other was that Corbyn has apparently drawn a false equivalence between NATO and Russia when it comes to the invasion of Ukraine. But as you should realise by now, that's just not true. We just showed you a clip where he explicitly said Putin, not NATO, is responsible for Russia's invasion. That from Keir Starmer was frankly just a lie.
People often think that the left-right dividing line inside social democracy in countries like Britain is a question of how high you want taxes to be on the rich or how much you want to nationalize things, these kind of economic questions. The fundamental dividing lines have so often been around questions of imperialism, as well as questions of migration, racism, the monarchy, questions about loyalty to the British nation state, where those on the moderate wing of social democracy are furiously opposed to the radicals, who they see as not only wanting to redistribute a few of the spoils to the working classes here at home, but also wanting to take apart a whole apparatus of control and domination, which stretches from the power that the boss has over our lives to the power that the police have over our lives, the power that soldiers have over the lives of so many people around the world. A politics of skepticism about imperial power all over the world has long been the thing that's been most hated on the Labour left and the left more generally. Why? Because it's a question of the politics of freedom. Jeremy Corbyn doesn't have what are sometimes presented in the media as strange, bizarre, sandal-wearing sympathies with people all around the world just because he's a kind of anorak who cares about South America because he went there as a young man and was inspired by Salvador Allende in Chile, because he cares about Palestinians just because he likes them. He cares about these things for the same reason that he cares about people here at home, because he wants everyone to live lives of freedom. And so it's very telling when a Labour politician doesn't care about the freedom of the Palestinian people, as Keir Starmer doesn't, or doesn't care about US-backed coups in South America, or doesn't have anything critical to say about NATO. When politicians don't care about these very helpless and desperate people all around the world, you have a clue about how they talk about you if they thought they could get away with it. That's why these apparently distant questions of foreign policy matter so much. NATO is a supposedly defensive alliance which has launched every major war in which it's been involved since 9/11. The claim to be defensive was emptied by the end of the Cold War when its antagonist disappeared. The Warsaw Pact was dissolved. So NATO found a new enemy spectre at the gates, terrorism. But the real goal is the defense of waning American hegemony and a unipolar world system. That's what NATO exists for. Any discussion of that is, of course, chilled in this land of free speech. These are things you can't say because the whole British state, its left and right wings, are united behind that kind of violence. Russia right now is the criminal, aggressive invader in Ukraine. NATO is the criminal, aggressive invader in Afghanistan, and its friends are in Yemen. These parties are not so different. They are two violent imperialist powers, and the only people who have credibility, as Jeremy Corbyn does, in standing standing with those Russian heroes protesting on Russia's streets against its war. The only people who have credibility, horrified when Russia breaks international law, ignores the UN Security Council, violates the sovereignty of an independent country, the only people who have any credibility in complaining about those things are the people who complain with equal force when Western powers or anyone around the world does exactly the same thing. You can't take seriously the concern for the freedom of Ukrainians from people who don't give a damn about other people's freedom when it's less convenient for their geopolitical aims.
Let's look at one more clip from that interview. This is the one that caused the most outrage from pundits on Twitter.
Jeremy, do you consider Zelensky a hero yourself?
He's stood up in a very difficult situation, and he's managed to unite people and get a very important world stage to expose what's going on. But the next stage has to be to stop the fighting. We can't just be spectators in the horror that's going on in front of us when, if we're in a position to do anything about it, we should do something about it.
Do you admire him as a leader?
I've never met him. I don't know.
Well,
I can't
I've
really
never met him, and I certainly admire him. Do you admire him?
I think he speaks well, and I admire that.
I think the outrage to that clip was obviously a little bit overblown, but I haven't met him isn't a great answer to the question of whether you admire someone. You can definitely admire people that you haven't yet met. Barnaby, how would you have answered that question?
Well, Michael, I don't know that I have a short answer, I'm afraid. I understand Corbyn's predicament. I mean, here's the truth. And the truth often is messy. Ukraine is today, as Russia was in the 1990s, an oligarchic kleptocracy with rival capitalist factions who compete to rule. Igor Kolomoisky, a major Ukrainian oligarch, launched Zelensky's career. He owns, I think, 4 TV channels, launched Zelensky's TV career. He's an oligarch who used to own Ukraine's biggest bank that I think was shut down for corruption. The Paradise Papers leak showed Zelensky and several of his close associates with large amounts of money and assets stored overseas in tax havens, though Zelensky claimed to be an anti-corruption candidate, assets that come from Kolomoisky. He's no angel. Kolomoisky, interestingly, though, was relatively pro-Russian. Zelensky was a peace candidate, unlike Poroshenko, his predecessor. And Zelensky was pushed into, and part of the sort of horror of Russia's invasion is that they didn't face a very saber-rattling Ukrainian president. Zelensky was pushed into confrontation with Russia by the pressures of domestic politics. Massive demonstrations in Kiev after he tried to sign a deal with Russia that could have granted Donbas region special autonomous status in 2020. So now, the situation in Ukraine is firstly that Zelensky is sort of forced to deal with a polity whose far right has been rendered crucial to it by 8 years of war in the East. The Azov battalion, neo-Nazi battalion, integrated into the Ukrainian army in 2014. Dmitry Yarosh of the right sector, a special advisor to the Ukrainian military. Kotsubelo, fascist militia leader, given a hero of Ukraine status by Zelensky. All these are things Zelensky is not especially keen on, but the hardline nationalistic presence is always upped by moments of war. And then secondly, you've got Zelensky now in a moment of war saying things like the fact he wants to model Ukraine, post-war Ukraine, not on any European country, but on heavily militarized Israel, a good kind of analogy for the way NATO sees Ukraine, a frontier of civilization against the barbaric wilderness. NATO supports highly reactionary politics in Ukraine, as it has all around the world. 2 things are true. Ukraine is treated as a pawn in Western imperialism's attempt to encircle and weaken Russia. And Ukraine has now been attacked in an imperialist invasion by Russia, which wants Ukraine to be its semi-colony and to rebuild the Russian empire that Lenin tore apart a century ago. And every Ukrainian has the right to defend themselves against that imperialist attack. Those 2 truths together are tricky. And so in each imperial bloc, you're only allowed to mention one of them. In Russia today, you're not allowed to talk about the imperialism of Russia's attack on Ukraine. And in the West, though, of course, less brutally, you're not allowed to talk about the way in which Western imperialism has treated Ukrainians as a pawn for so long. That's what I'd say, but I'll never be leader of the Labour Party.